Metaverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and a number of years ago I made a video looking at some of the biggest misconceptions about medieval weapons in fantasy, video games, and role-playing games. But since that time, I've been able to learn a lot more. So much so that there's actually even more misconceptions, very common misconceptions that I see and I want to talk about. But not only that, I also own a lot more of the weapons, so I can actually demonstrate to you how they work in real life. So we're revisiting the topic in a bigger, better way. Let's get started. The first misconception that we're going to look at is about daggers, but in extension to that, weapon damage generally, because there is a big misunderstanding in fantasy and video games. And basically, the fundamental point is daggers should not be depicted as doing so little damage in many of the rule systems. Compare this dagger length to this spear. If someone was struck with this dagger to the hilt, why on earth would it do less damage than this spear, which can do very comparable damage or penetration? And if you're thinking the spear can penetrate deeper, some spears actually have lugs to prevent that, because that can be a bad thing. Daggers simply should be able to do vastly more damage than what the rule sets in many video games, role-playing games, and just fantasy generally depicts them as having. The big difference between a dagger and spear is not their damage potential, but the ease in which you can strike an opponent. The spear, of course, has range, reach, also some leverage on top of that. But in contrast, there are angles in which you can hold a dagger to get certain points of leverage to get deeper penetration with a dagger over a spear. And so dagger damage should simply be a lot higher. Another misconception about daggers is that in most fantasy role-playing games, they are all universally able to be used as thrown weapons as well. Now, yes, you can throw a dagger just like you can throw a sword, but most daggers are very poorly weighted for throwing and just make poor throwing weapons overall. That's why dedicated throwing daggers are designed quite differently to your stereotypical combat dagger. And you should actually get some negatives in trying to throw this thing versus a dagger that is made for it. This leads us into the next misconception, which is about short swords. Many short swords can easily do as much damage, cutting potential, as these arming swords I am holding. In actual fact, some of them can do vastly more. This short sword here is made by Midgard Messer. We are going to be doing a dedicated review on this because it is a beast. It weighs a decent chunk more than this arming sword, and as a result, its power is insane. Yet in many rule systems, this sword would do less damage than this arming sword. And there are multiple reasons to explain that. The big one is weight concentration. This has a lot more concentrated weight on the striking end than this arming sword, and it actually is a bit heavier. It will do more damage than this one. The advantage the arming sword has is, once again, reach. One of the things you might be noticing is that one of the more significant qualities that should be used to make distinction between these weapons in fantasy role-playing games and fantasy in general is actually reach over damage. A lot of these weapons are actually quite comparable in their lethality potential, but their ability or reach to be able to strike an opponent, that can vary greatly. Everything that I've talked about also applies significantly to the arming sword or single-handed sword category. A lot of those short swords we just talked about can easily cut just as well as many of these arming swords. Some can cut vastly more so because they have such concentrated, serious weight in them. Arming swords are actually a very diverse category of sword with many variants between them, with some having vastly different cutting capacity, but then speed and maneuverability differences. And so it doesn't make sense that all arming swords are lumped together in the same category, given the same damage capacity, speed, and other qualities, especially when the damage potential between arming swords, short swords, and yes, long swords can be very equivalent. The big difference, once again, is reach and your ability to use something in your offhand. Next misconception is about long swords and bastard swords. In most fantasy role-playing games, the bastard sword is a sword that is used in two hands, but can be used effectively in one hand if you have a bit more training. That simply does not play out with real-world longswords, because longswords have some decent variance in length. This one is what you would more identify as a bastard sword, and you do not need any additional training to use this sword one-handed as you would with an arming sword. In fact, this arming sword has a very equivalent length of blade to this bastard sword, so why would you need additional training to use this one-handed where you don't need for this one? And when I say training, usually this is in classic rules like D&D 3 or 3.5, and that's trained to be used effectively. Anyone can use a bastard sword one-handed, but you get negatives without an extra bit of training on top of it. In actual fact, the long sword should be broken up into 3 categories: bastard sword, long sword, and war sword. Each sword has differences in their range and leverage, also speed, depending on the weight balance, but interestingly enough, in terms of damage potential, it depends on the profile of the blade. This bastard sword here can actually cut just as well as this war sword here. Yes, I can get more leverage on it, but the bastard sword's weight is more concentrated, which means its cutting potential is pretty much equivalent. Again, the big advantage that I have out of this sword is my range and then leverage, which doesn't necessarily affect damage as much as you might think, because again, smaller swords can do really good damage, but that does affect speed. If I've got greater leverage on the blade, I can manipulate its speed a bit quicker for its size. Next big misconception, the rapier is not a light sword for its size. In fact, this arming sword I'm holding is lighter than this rapier, but the rapier seems to get certain benefits because it's perceived as being lighter or a more nimble weapon. Nimbleness is a bit of a complex topic because due to its weight profile, its weight distribution, you do have really great point control with a rapier. It's not to say you don't have good point control with an arming sword, especially one like this, but the bigger differences between these two swords isn't necessarily maneuverability due to weight, and not necessarily point control, because you can get some really light, nimble arming swords, but it's more about reach and damage potential in thrusting versus cutting. This sacrifices a bit of cutting ability, still can cut really well by the way, for added advantage in the thrust, where this one, bit better in the cut, still great at thrusting. And then of course there is the thing I've been talking about, reach and range. Once again, the main big distinction that affects how weapons operate, the way that you use them and what makes them distinct versus other weapons, is not necessarily the amount of damage they can do in terms of how deep cuts, everything like that. A lot of swords can be quite equivalent. It's in their leverage and the range in which you can use them effectively. Also, the rapier is not really a medieval weapon, it's Renaissance, so depending on what you want in your fantasy, it might not necessarily fit. And in extension to the discussion about nimbleness and point control, this leads us to our next misconception, and that is most standard size longswords, not talking about bastard swords, though they would get this advantage if used in 2 hands, or war swords, which are a bit more cumbersome and wouldn't necessarily get this advantage. The misconception is that most longswords are fast, nimble weapons and should have finesse bonuses. They are easily as nimble and got just as good point control as rapiers. Yet rapiers are often depicted as being nimble, fast weapons with good point control. Longswords are usually forgotten entirely, and they're just lumped in with bastard swords. And even when they are acknowledged, they are not considered fast, agile weapons, as opposed to other weapons. No, most longswords' weight profile is incredibly nimble. This is such a fast sword. And with 2 hands, absolutely would count as a finesse weapon. Perhaps not in 1 hand, but 2 hands, absolutely. When talking about the fact that the reach of the weapon is a vastly greater differentiating category versus damage, this comes into play quite a bit in regards to axes, especially in compared to swords. Axes generally have much less reach than swords, and they're kind of sacrificing that to have greater damage potential. And yet axes are often depicted as quite interchangeable with swords. A one-handed Battleaxe in many role-playing or game systems does about the same damage as a one-handed sword, when in actual fact it's capable of doing vastly more damage, but landing a hit on your target is a bit more difficult because of reach, and you need more power generation to do a lethal hit with an axe, where with a sword, you actually don't need huge amounts of power generation to do a lethal strike, either thrusting or even just cutting, drawing that blade back. Real combat battle axes also have thin axe heads. This is to reduce that weight to make them much more maneuverable, because these are not wood axes, they are battle axes. Have a look at how thin these axe heads are. On profile, they might look somewhat thick, but in reality, much thinner. Continuing on with the misconceptions about axes, this style of axe is mostly fantasy. There are examples of double-headed axes that existed historically, some ornamental, some that do look functional, but for the vast majority, they are far more rare, because why have a second axe head which does the exact same thing as the first axe head, so it's a bit redundant, when you could have a vicious spike on the back which gives more versatility and options in combat. You come across a material that the axe head can't penetrate, flip that thing around and you have a deadly pick. The next misconception about axes is to think they all had very small axe heads. We don't want the pendulum to swing too far in the opposite direction. It is true that most real combat axes had much small axe heads versus the ones in fantasy. This is more close to fantasy, but it is showing what I'm depicting, which is a type of axe called a bearded axe, which has this kind of flared bottom point, which increases the cutting ratio on axes, and there are many historical examples. Now, the next misconception about axes is the misunderstanding between one-handed and two-handed axes. This is what you would call a mid-range two-handed axe, very similar in size to wood-felling axes. But here's the thing, if you are going to devote 2 hands on a weapon, why restrict it to being so short? That's why most two-handed combat axes were bigger, and it's vastly more rare to come across battle axes in this size. There are a couple of exceptions. The Battleaxe is one of them, as well as one we've even looked at on the channel here in our dedicated video on axes. But those types of two-handed axes are actually vastly more the exception and not the rule. When it comes to two-handed axes, like I said, if you're going to be devoting 2 hands on a weapon, why restrict yourself to a shorter one when you can easily just lengthen the shaft? You don't even need to increase the size of the axe head, just make it bigger and you get vastly more reach and power as a result. And so the two-handed axes of history are not the fantasy double-headed axes that we see so commonly depicted, but rather much bigger versions of them. Because you have, yes, the Dane axe, what I have here, but then why restrict yourself to only having an axe head? Why not add a hammerhead and spike, and then you have the Polearm or the halberd. These are the two-handed axes from history, and in my opinion, they're just so much cooler than the stereotypical double-headed fantasy axe. Let's change it up a bit and move to bows. There is a widely, massively perpetuated misconception about bows in fantasy, and it's that bigger bows do more damage. This is false. A longbow is not an inherently more powerful bow, nor was every longbow higher in draw weight. There are countless examples of medieval hunting longbows that would not have had a high draw weight. You only need those draw weights when it comes to combat, for range, and trying to penetrate armor. This short bow I am holding has a draw weight of 110 pounds. It is a more powerful bow than this longbow I'm holding, which is still a war bow. It has a draw weight of 100 pounds. Yet you would never guess it by looking at them. People just associate smaller with being weaker. Now, I have a whole dedicated video going into detail as to the ins and outs, the whys, and why the longbow is such a good bow, but also talking about some of its misconceptions and also shortcomings. So check out that dedicated video for the full information, but I'll repeat again, the longbow is not an inherently more powerful bow. It has other advantages, economic advantages, consistency and reliability, but the shortbow actually has some really interesting advantages over the longbow. But let's get rid of that myth that the longbow is always so powerful. Get some powerful short bows, just like what I'm displaying right here. Another misconception that more predominantly has arisen in Dungeons & Dragons, but is likely to have appeared in other fantasy games, and it's that the falchion is not the two-handed equivalent of the scimitar. First, scimitar is an umbrella term to a number of curved swords. The stereotypical scimitar is actually the shamshir, and the falchion is more commonly a single-handed sword, even though there are two-handed versions of the falchion as well. The falchion is a medieval sword with many blade profiles, not to be confused with Middle Eastern swords, even though there can be some similarities, and I could see why people might think this two-handed falchion is a two-handed equivalent of a curved shamshir, but there are actually distinct differences. This falchion here does not have nearly as pronounced a curve on it, and it's actually its own distinct type of sword. Spears are too often depicted as being too weak and not as effective as many other weapons in the rule systems of many fantasy role-playing games and video games. The spear is one of the most deadly martial weapons ever used. On balance, it is generally considered to be a superior weapon to many two-handed swords, to many axes. It has basically been the most favored and more predominantly represented weapon in battles throughout human history. Yet in many video games, role-playing games, the spear is considered to do less damage and is also considered a simple weapon. And yes, some of the basic combative maneuvers might seem simple on its surface. There is easily as much martial requirement to learn how to use a spear as effectively as possible as many other types of weapons. And while we're on the subject of training, let's talk about bows and crossbows. Crossbows do not inherently shoot a projectile with as much power as many types of bows. It is true that many crossbows have a higher pound draw weight, but because the string gets pulled back over a shorter distance and therefore it has less time to impart that energy to the projectile, that is called the power stroke. Even a crossbow with a crazy high draw weight oftentimes will shoot a projectile with about as much power as a decent warbow with a good draw weight on it. Bows have a much wider power stroke, which means a longer distance for the string to travel to impart energy on the projectile. So then why did people even use crossbows if they're not necessarily more powerful and they shoot at a much lower rate of fire than the bow? Well, this comes to a really important fact that very few games, fantasy settings actually acknowledge. The training requirements to be proficient and reliably accurate with a bow is much, much higher than not only the crossbow, most other weapons. In fact, if people were being realistic in terms of the training requirement to be good with a bow, it should almost take double the skill points to be proficiently, reliably accurate with a bow as it would be to train to use a sword in a functional way. It doesn't take too much training to figure out how to use a sword functionally, but to get that arrow on target regularly, vastly more effort and time is needed. The crossbow's biggest advantage, which is rarely reflected in many fantasy role-playing games, RPGs, and fantasy settings, is that it takes so little training to be reliably accurate with it, and it is very powerful and deadly. Not necessarily more powerful than a warbow, but the training requirement is the big difference. But people historically did find that even though crossbows shoot at a far lesser rate, the fact that really anybody could pick it up and use it, not even after a lengthy moment of explanation or training, made the crossbow a very useful weapon. The next big misconception is that great swords are not crazy, heavy, crude weapons. I don't have a steel one yet. The postage to get real ones in is a bit excessive, and I'm still looking for one that I really like. But this wooden prop serves well. This is a very accurate analog to the dimensions of real historical greatswords, and have a look how thin this blade is. As a result, these blades are nimble, effective, fast, and they are just incredible. And the types of maneuverings that you see them work with in terms of the tree scissors are brilliant. The main advantages they should get is threat range, crowd control. Look at the area that I can target, as well as the reach, a massive one. Not necessarily damage potential. That's probably the biggest misconception I'm trying to address in this main video. A greatsword of this size doesn't necessarily cut better than an arming sword with a good weight profile, which concentrates its force onto a solid cut. This will get advantages out of leverage. The fact that it's so long means the tip will be moving at a higher speed, but think about the amount of mass that would actually be striking the target. It is still a thin blade, and if you have a blade which concentrates the weight into a more focused area, it can easily cut just as powerfully as some really big swords. That's not to say every arming sword can do that. It depends on the weight profile. There are thinner, more nimble arming swords, and there are bigger, more powerful great swords that would be able to cut greater. But generally speaking, great swords are not these heavy, cumbersome weapons where you can barely lift them and you have to swing them around like this, like they're often shown in Dark Souls games, for instance. And now let's throw in a bonus misconception about the katana, because it often appears in medieval fantasy settings. Now, of course, I have dedicated entire videos just addressing the multiple misconceptions and misunderstandings about this beautiful sword. But in regards to medieval fantasy, a genre that is about adventurers in serious combat, it's that the type of katana that people often think about, the standard size, is actually a bit on the shorter end. The length of this katana blade is actually shorter than this arming sword, Viking period sword, blade length. Because if you're going to be using two hands on a sword, why would you limit yourself to the standard katana length when there are many katanas that are much longer, like the Dai katana, also known as the O katana, which is vastly more equivalent to a long sword and makes much more sense for an adventurer that knows they're going into combat more. The standard size katana is more of a sidearm length sword, where there are many types of Japanese sword, which is more of a combat type sword, which suits medieval fantasy much better. The next misconception: the flail is a junk weapon, nobody should use them, and if you do, you should be embarrassed. Alright, fine, that's my own bias peeking through. A flail has some utility. It is certainly a force multiplier. I just believe it has many detrimental limitations and problems. You can look at my full video explaining that. I don't like it, but seriously, I do not think it should be depicted as equivalently effective as a good mace. And on that note, that leads us to another misconception. A morning star is not a spiked ball on a chain. That's just another type of flail. A morning star is actually a subtype of mace, spiked ball on a stick. And when it comes to other misconceptions about maces, the main one is that sometimes they are depicted as equivalently effective as, say, swords or axes, when these are more situational, specialized weapons better for combating armor. But when compared to things like axes or swords, axes actually have greater damage potential because of the axe head focusing that, force onto an even finer edge. You need more force to generate lethal strikes with maces, and their range in comparison to swords are just vastly less. So they should be given special bonuses when used in the right circumstances, and negatives when used outside of those circumstances. They are a more generally specialized weapon. Not to say maces aren't deadly, they absolutely are. There are just some limitations when used outside of the things they're specialized to do. Shields are often depicted in fantasy as being mostly invulnerable. Unless the game has a general durability rating on all items, I've never seen a shield break in a video game or role-playing game. They seem to just be invincible, when a lot of historical shields would take significant damage and also get penetrated by projectiles, arrows, and bolts. Dependent on the type of shield, depends on the level of protection they can give. But even thicker shields can be penetrated to a sometimes scary degree from a solid arrow shot by a very powerful warbow. Some shields were even made to be somewhat weak on the edge, so when a blade came in, it would dig into the shield and get trapped. A shield after excessive use would get damaged a lot, to the point where you could almost consider them disposable, temporary items made to be regularly replaced. That is, of course, based on regular use and them getting damaged. I mean, if they're barely getting hit and you're not going into combat a lot, your shield will last a long time. But if you are going to combat a lot and it's taking a lot of hits, damage is a very regular thing, sometimes an even useful thing, trapping opponents' weapons, but that is rarely ever shown in fantasy. Polearms generally should be given more advantages in rule sets and fantasy games. They are basically some of the primary battlefield weapons historically, and that's for a reason. They are crazy powerful. Why didn't everyone use them then? Well, they can also be quite awkward to carry around. They're big, they're cumbersome. But the advantages you have when using a polearm over many other types of weapons is actually a bit crazy. But oftentimes in fantasy, they're only given slight benefits. These should have huge bonuses in terms of attack scores. Their ability to strike an opponent is so much greater because of their reach. These ones legitimately have much higher damage potential than what we've kind of been talking about throughout the video, because of the leverage that they have on the length of these things. Whereas in contrast, a lot of swords can do somewhat equivalent damage dependent on weight profile, weight concentration. A good polearm that has a certain amount of reach and leverage generally will be able to generate a lot more power and therefore have much higher damage potential. Also, higher bonuses against fighting people in armor, have a lot of utility and versatility in terms of thrusting, bracing against charges, used in formation. Polearms are just generally underrated like across the board. They are crazy powerful weapons which give huge advantages, more than many people assume, and is depicted in many rules. Not necessarily a misconception, but the Bector Corbin is awesome and should appear in more fantasy settings, absolutely. I'm just saying. And there we go. Some of the more prominent or common misconceptions about medieval weapons in medieval fantasy, movies, video games, role-playing games, the whole go. Let me know if I've missed one. If you can think of a common misconception you've seen a lot, share them in the comments. I genuinely want to see them. I do hope you have enjoyed, and if you've come this far in the video, it means you've probably enjoyed it. Something has kept you sticking around, and I hope it's good reasons. And so if that's the case, why not subscribe if you haven't? And if you have subscribed, check out another video, because it seems like you like the content, or at least I hope you do. And so check out this video on the common types of myths about armor, where we also put some to the test. It's right there. I hope to see you there. And until that time, farewell.